A billionaire visits his son's grave like he does every Sunday. But this time, someone's already there. A young boy whispering to the headstone. When the billionaire approaches, the boy runs, leaving behind a locket. Inside, a photo of the billionaire's late son and a woman he doesn't recognize. What happens next will change everything. The wind howled through the empty cemetery as Simon Hall stepped out of his black Mercedes, the weight of the past pressing down on him like it always did on Sundays. He pulled his coat tighter against the morning chill and started down the familiar path toward his son's grave. It had been 10 years since Michael's accident, 10 years of unanswered questions, time spent in this same ritual, standing before the cold marble headstone, speaking words to a son who could no longer hear them. But today was different. As Simon approached, he noticed a small figure kneeling in front of the grave. A boy sat cross-legged in the damp grass, his back to Simon. He was hunched over, whispering something to the stone. His clothes were worn, his dark hair messy, and his thin frame suggested he hadn't had a proper meal in days. A small paper boat rested beside him on the ground, swaying slightly in the breeze. Simon stopped a few feet away, unsure whether to speak or wait for the boy to notice him. His presence here at Michael's grave made no sense. Who was he? And what was he saying? Before Simon could find his voice, the boy stiffened, as if sensing he was being watched. Slowly, he turned his head, and when their eyes met, Simon felt his breath catch in his throat. The boy's eyes were blue, the exact same shade as Michael's. For a moment, neither of them moved. The boy's expression flickered between fear and recognition, though Simon was certain they had never met before. His mind raced with questions, but before he could ask a single one, the boy jumped to his feet and bolted, running toward the trees at the edge of the cemetery. "Wait!" Simon called out, taking a step forward, but the boy was fast, too fast for a man his age to chase. Within seconds, he had disappeared into the woods, leaving nothing behind but footprints in the wet grass. Frustration burned in Simon's chest. Who was that child? And why did he run? Then something on the ground caught his eye. A small object lay in the grass where the boy had been sitting. Simon crouched down and picked it up. A locket, old and worn, its chain broken. He turned it over in his fingers, then carefully pried it open. Inside was a tiny, faded photograph. His heart stopped. It was Michael. Michael as a teenager, smiling in a way Simon hadn't seen in years. But he wasn't alone. Beside him stood a young woman Simon didn't recognize. They were close, her arm looped around his, her head tilted toward him with a look of quiet affection. His fingers tightened around the locket as his gaze fell to the inscription inside. "Forever connected." A chill ran down his spine. Who was she? And more importantly, who was that boy? Simon sat in the back of his car, the locket clutched tightly in his hand. The weight of it felt heavier than it should, as if the tiny piece of jewelry carried not just a photo but the ghost of a past he never knew existed. He ran his thumb over the inscription. Forever connected. The words haunted him. The boy had Michael's eyes. There was no denying it. And the woman in the photo, who was she? Why had she been important enough to be in a locket alongside his son? More importantly, why had that boy been at Michael's grave, whispering to a father who had been dead for a decade? Simon needed answers. He pulled out his phone and called the one man he knew could find them. "Mason," he said the moment the line connected. "I need you to find someone." Mason Turner had worked for Simon for nearly 15 years. As a private investigator, he had solved more than a few delicate problems for Hall Industries, discreetly, efficiently, and without asking too many questions. "Who am I looking for?" Mason asked. "A boy, 10, maybe 11. Dark hair, blue eyes, thin. He was at Michael's grave today, alone. He ran before I could talk to him, but he left something behind." Simon hesitated, glancing at the locket again. He didn't want to explain everything yet. Not until he was sure. "I need to know who he is, and I need to know fast." "Got it," Mason said. "I'll check the cemetery security footage, see where he came from. I'll call you as soon as I find something." Simon hung up and stared out the window as the city blurred past. His mind wouldn't let go of the possibility that had started to take shape, a possibility that made his hands tighten into fists. Could that boy be Michael's? The thought was ridiculous. If Michael had fathered a child, Simon would have known. Wouldn't he? But then the locket, the eyes, the way the boy had sat at the grave, as if talking to someone he missed, someone he knew. Simon's jaw clenched. If this was true, if this boy was Michael's, then why had he never known? And where had he been all these years? The call from Mason came that same evening. "I found him," Mason said without preamble. Simon straightened in his chair. "Who is he?" "His name is Noah Morgan, 10 years old. Lives with his mother, Avery Morgan. They've been moving between motels for the past few months. No permanent address. No records of a father." Simon's grip on the phone tightened. "Avery Morgan," he repeated, testing the name. It meant nothing to him. "Who is she?" Mason hesitated. "She was close to Michael. I found some old college photos. She and Michael spent a lot of time together. Then, right after his death, she disappeared. No job history, no credit cards, nothing. It's like she was trying to vanish." Simon felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Why would she do that?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Mason admitted. "But here's the thing. She's not just hiding. She's running." Simon's brows furrowed. "From what?" "That's the question," Mason said grimly. "I checked into the places they've stayed. She never uses her real name twice. They pay in cash. And from what I gathered, she moves Noah the moment she thinks someone might be watching." Simon's mind raced. If Avery had truly been close to Michael, why had she vanished after his death? Why had she never come forward? Why had she never told him that his son had a child? Unless she had a reason to be afraid. A new thought hit him, one that sent ice through his veins. "Mason," he said, his voice low, "is there any chance Noah is Michael's son?" Silence stretched over the line. Then, finally, "It's not just a chance," Mason said. "I'd bet my life on it." Simon exhaled slowly, pressing a hand to his temple. He had spent a decade grieving his son, believing he had lost the last piece of him forever. And now, suddenly, Michael's legacy wasn't just a memory. It was a living, breathing child, one who had been hidden from him. And if Mason was right, one who might be in danger. "Find them," Simon ordered. "Now." Mason's voice was firm. "Already on it." As the call ended, Simon looked down at the locket one more time. Forever connected. Whatever secrets Avery Morgan had been hiding, he would uncover them. Because no matter what it took, he wasn't about to lose his grandson. The air was thick with the smell of damp concrete and rust. The abandoned warehouse stood at the edge of the city, its walls covered in graffiti, its broken windows letting in slivers of dying sunlight. Simon Hall stepped out of his car, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings. Mason had tracked Avery and Noah here. It wasn't much, just another temporary hiding spot in what seemed like a long, exhausting escape. Simon's heart pounded harder than it had in years. He had spent his entire life controlling every aspect of his world, making decisions that shaped fortunes, companies, lives. And yet, standing outside this crumbling building, he felt powerless. Somewhere inside was the grandson he had never known, and a woman who had stolen a decade of his family's legacy. Mason stood beside him, gun tucked beneath his coat. "I don't think she'll run this time," he murmured. "She's backed into a corner." Simon didn't answer. He pushed open the heavy warehouse door, the rusted metal groaning under his touch. The space inside was hollow, empty but for a few scattered pieces of old furniture and a mattress in the corner. A single dim light bulb flickered above. And there, standing in the shadows, was Avery Morgan. She was thinner than he expected. Her dark hair was tied back, her face pale and lined with exhaustion. But her eyes, the same deep blue as Noah's and Michael's, were sharp with determination. She wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid of what he represented. Noah stood behind her, gripping the hem of her coat. When he saw Simon, his small hands tightened into fists. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Simon took a slow step forward. "You've been running from me," he said. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of 10 years of betrayal. "Why?" Avery exhaled shakily. "You need to leave," she said. Simon shook his head. "Not until I get answers." Her jaw clenched. "There are things you don't understand, things you don't want to understand. Walking into this will only put you in danger." Simon's patience snapped. "Danger from who?" Avery hesitated. Then she turned to Noah. "Go to the other room, sweetheart." Noah hesitated, his eyes darting between them. "But Mom..." "Now, Noah." Reluctantly, the boy obeyed, disappearing through a half-broken door. When Avery turned back to Simon, her face was a mixture of anger and exhaustion. "You think I kept him from you out of spite?" she whispered. "You think I wanted this life for him?" Simon's fists clenched at his sides. "I don't know what to think, Avery. All I know is that my son had a child and I never knew. That boy has my blood, and you've spent a decade keeping him away." "Why?" Avery swallowed hard. Then finally she spoke. "Because Michael didn't die in an accident." Simon went still. Avery's voice was raw. "He was murdered." The word hit him like a physical blow. He took a step back, shaking his head. "That's not possible. The police report was a lie." Avery's voice cracked. "Michael found something, Simon. Something he wasn't supposed to. He came to me that night, terrified. He said he had proof that someone inside Hall Industries was involved in something illegal, something big, and that he needed to go to you. But he never got the chance." Simon's breathing became uneven. "What proof?" Avery squeezed her hands into fists. "I don't know. He never told me details. But whatever it was, he knew it was dangerous. He said he'd uncovered something that could destroy the company, and that if the wrong people found out, they'd come after him. That night, he was in a panic. He said he had to see you. He left my apartment, and a few hours later, he was dead." Simon's pulse roared in his ears. Michael's accident. The crash. He had always struggled to accept it. It had never made sense. The timing. The way Michael had been driving alone on a road he never took. The way his car had gone up in flames so quickly. And now, Avery was telling him it hadn't been an accident at all. "Why didn't you come to me?" he demanded, his voice hoarse. Avery's expression hardened. "Because I didn't know who to trust. And because the moment Michael died, someone came after me." Simon's blood ran cold. "What?" Avery nodded, her hands trembling. "The night after the funeral, I found my apartment trashed. Someone had broken in, torn everything apart. They were looking for something. And then the calls started, warnings, threats, telling me to disappear. And I knew that if they found out I was pregnant, Noah would never be safe." Simon's throat tightened. "Who was it? Who was behind this?" Avery shook her head. "I don't know. I never saw their faces. But they weren't just some random criminals, Simon. They had resources. They knew things." The weight of her words pressed down on him. Someone in his company had been involved in Michael's death, and they had spent a decade making sure the truth stayed buried. Before he could speak, headlights flashed through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. A car. Then another. Avery's face turned white. "They've found us." Simon's instincts took over. He grabbed Avery's wrist and pulled her back toward the small, dark hallway. "Get Noah," he ordered in a low voice. Avery hesitated for only a second before running toward the back room. Meanwhile, Simon moved toward the nearest window, careful to keep out of sight. He peeked through a broken section of glass, his heart pounding as two black SUVs rolled to a stop outside the warehouse. The engines idled for a moment before the doors swung open. 4 men stepped out, dressed in dark suits, their movements precise, professional. This wasn't a random threat. These men were trained. One of them, a tall, broad-shouldered figure, pulled out a gun with a silencer and signaled to the others. They spread out, approaching the building from different angles. Simon cursed under his breath and pulled out his phone, dialing Mason's number. "Mason, we have a problem. Talk to me." Mason's voice was sharp. They found us. For men. Armed. Black SUVs. Mason swore. I'm 15 minutes out. Can you hold them off? Simon's jaw tightened. I don't have a choice. He ended the call just as Avery reappeared, gripping Noah's hand. The boy looked terrified, his small fingers clutching the edge of his mother's coat. Mom! Noah whispered. What's happening? Avery knelt beside him, keeping her voice calm even as her hands shook. Sweetheart, we're gonna play a little game. Okay? We have to be very quiet, and we have to move fast. Noah nodded, his wide blue eyes darting between them. Simon turned to Avery. There's a back exit? She swallowed hard. Yeah, but if they're professionals, they'll have it covered. They're trying to corner us, but they don't know we're expecting it. Simon took a deep breath, forcing his mind to sharpen. He had built an empire by thinking faster than his enemies. This was no different, except the stakes were higher than they had ever been. Do you trust me? He asked Avery. She hesitated. Then, with a look at Noah, she nodded. Simon moved quickly. We split up. You take Noah and slip out the side. Stay low, move fast. I'll create a distraction. Avery's eyes widened. A distraction? Simon, they'll kill you. Not if I kill them first. Before she could argue, the sound of footsteps echoed just outside the metal door. There was no time. Simon grabbed a rusted metal pipe from the ground and nodded toward the side exit. Go. Now. Avery squeezed Noah's hand and pulled him toward the shadows. Simon crouched low, pressing himself against the wall as the front door creaked open. A figure stepped inside, gun raised, moving carefully through the dim warehouse. Another followed, their eyes sweeping the room. Simon didn't wait. With precise, calculated force, he swung the pipe, striking the first man across the back of the head. The impact sent the man crumpling to the ground before he could fire his weapon. The second man spun toward the noise, raising his gun. Simon slammed into him, forcing the barrel away just as the silencer let out a muted thud. The bullet embedded itself in the wall. Simon grabbed the man's wrist and twisted, forcing the gun loose. Clattered to the ground. He threw a punch, his first in years, but it was enough to knock the man off balance. He didn't stop to fight. He ran. Gunfire erupted behind him, but he was already diving behind a stack of wooden crates. More footsteps stormed in. They were coming from all sides now. He needed to buy more time. Simon grabbed the fallen gun and fired 3 precise shots at the overhead lights. The warehouse was instantly plunged into darkness. Shouts filled the air. Fan out. Find them. Simon took the chance to slip through the back corridor, heart pounding. He had no idea if Avery and Noah had made it out yet. Then, just as he reached the side door, he heard something that made his blood freeze. A child's cry. Noah. Simon didn't think. He sprinted outside, into the narrow alleyway behind the warehouse. Avery was struggling against one of the men, her hands clawing at his grip. Another man held Noah, his hand clamped over the boy's mouth. Simon lifted the gun without hesitation. Let him go. The man holding Noah sneered. Or what? Simon fired. The bullet struck the ground an inch from the man's foot. The message was clear. Let him go. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, from the distance, the roar of an approaching car. Mason. The man holding Noah hesitated, then cursed and shoved the boy away, grabbing his injured partner and retreating into the night. Avery fell to her knees, pulling Noah into her arms. Simon exhaled shakily, lowering the gun. Mason's car skidded to a stop, the passenger door flying open. Get in. They didn't need to be told twice. Avery, Noah, and Simon piled into the car as Mason hit the gas, tires screeching against the pavement. Simon turned in his seat, watching as the warehouse grew smaller in the distance. They won't stop, Avery whispered. Simon clenched his jaw. Neither will I. She looked at him, searching his face. What are you going to do? Simon's grip tightened around the locket in his pocket. I'm going to end this. Simon Hall had spent his entire life making decisions that shaped the world around him. But no decision had ever been more important than the one he was about to make. Sitting in the back of Mason's car, watching the city lights blur past, he felt the weight of the past 10 years pressing down on him. Michael had been murdered. His company, his own empire, had played a part in it. And the people responsible had spent a decade making sure the truth stayed buried. Until now, Noah was curled up in Avery's arms, still trembling from the attack. Avery held him tightly, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes burned with quiet determination. She had spent 10 years running, hiding, trying to protect their son alone. She wouldn't have to anymore. Simon pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. The voice on the other end answered immediately. "Mr. Hall, call an emergency board meeting. Tonight." There was a brief hesitation. "Sir, it's almost midnight." "I don't care," Simon cut in coldly. "Get them all in the conference room within the hour. And make sure Charles White is there." The line went silent. Then, "Understood, sir." Simon ended the call and turned to Mason. "Take us to the Hall building." Mason's hands tightened on the wheel. "You sure about this?" Simon's expression was unreadable. "It ends tonight." An hour later, Simon walked into the gleaming glass conference room at the top of Hall Industries. The city skyline stretched beyond the windows, but the view was the last thing on his mind. The board of directors sat around the long mahogany table, murmuring in confusion. They weren't used to being summoned like this, especially in the middle of the night. At the head of the table sat Charles White, the company's CFO. He was an older man with silver hair, polished and composed as always, but Simon saw the flicker of unease in his eyes. Simon didn't sit. He stood at the head of the room, looking each of them in the eye. When he spoke, his voice was calm, controlled, but it carried the weight of something unstoppable. 10 years ago, my son was murdered." Silence fell. Several board members shifted uncomfortably. White leaned forward, forcing a skeptical smile. "Simon, I'm not sure where you're getting." "Shut up." The words were soft, but they cut through the room like a blade. White's mouth snapped shut. Simon placed a file on the table. "Michael found something before he died. He discovered an operation inside this company, an illegal offshore network tied to Project Genesis. He was going to expose it." His eyes locked onto White. "And that's why he was killed." The air in the room tightened. White scoffed, but his fingers twitched against the table. "This is absurd. Project Genesis was a research initiative. It was a front." Simon's voice darkened. "A cover for laundering millions into illegal ventures. And when Michael got too close, someone made sure he didn't live long enough to talk." No one spoke. The weight of the accusation filled the air like poison. White laughed, forced, brittle. "Do you even hear yourself? You think someone inside this boardroom had your own son killed?" Simon didn't answer. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a single folded document. Then, slowly, he slid it across the table. Mason had found it buried in the company's old records. An approval memo for a high-level containment operation tied to Project Genesis. The signature at the bottom belonged to Charles White. White stared at it. His face paled. And then he made a mistake. He hesitated. Simon saw the moment the fight left his body. The way his shoulders tensed. The way his hands curled into fists. "Michael wasn't supposed to know," White muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. He wasn't supposed to dig." A ripple of shock spread across the room. Simon stepped closer. "You ordered his death." White swallowed hard, beads of sweat forming on his brow. "It wasn't my decision alone. The board—" "Don't." Simon's voice was lethal. "Don't you dare try to spread the blame. You signed the order. You sent men to silence my son. And when Avery survived, you spent 10 years trying to find her and my grandson." White's breathing grew rapid. The polished executive facade was slipping. "I was protecting the company," he stammered. "If Michael had gone public—" Simon moved so fast the others barely had time to react. 1 second, he was standing across the table. The next, he had grabbed White by the collar, yanking him to his feet. "You don't get to say his name," Simon snarled. White gasped, his hands shaking. Simon didn't let go. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to resign. You're going to confess everything. And then you're going to pray that the justice system gets to you before I do. White opened his mouth, but the words never came. Because at that moment, the conference room doors burst open. Two uniformed officers strode in, their expressions unreadable. "Mr. White," one of them said, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder." White sagged in Simon's grip, his face draining of color. Simon stepped back, watching as the officers pulled White's hands behind his back and cuffed him. As they dragged him out of the room, White turned back, eyes desperate. "Simon, please. I was just protecting." The doors slammed shut. Silence filled the room. The board members sat frozen, too afraid to move. Simon exhaled slowly, then turned toward them. "As of this moment, I'm stepping down as CEO." Murmurs of shock rippled across the table. "Simon, you? Enough." His voice silenced them. "This company has been rotting from the inside, and I won't be part of it anymore." Without another word, he turned and walked out. An hour later, Simon stood outside his estate, the cold wind brushing against his face. Avery stood beside him, watching Noah chase fireflies in the grass. "He's safe now," she murmured. Simon nodded. He had spent 10 years grieving his son, believing he had lost the last piece of Michael forever. But looking at Noah, his grandson, he realized something. Michael wasn't gone. His legacy was standing right in front of him, and Simon would do everything in his power to protect it. Avery turned to him, hesitating. "So, what happens now?" Simon looked at her, then at Noah, and for the first time in a decade, he knew exactly what to say. "Now we start over." A father's death, a decade of secrets, and a grandson who was never meant to be found. What started as a routine visit to a grave became a fight for the truth, one that would uncover betrayal, danger, and an unexpected second chance at family. But is the fight truly over? Or is this just the beginning? If you love gripping stories with twists that keep you on edge, subscribe to Embrace the Journey for more, because sometimes the journey changes everything.